All right, everybody, welcome back to the channel tonight. Tonight with me, I have our performance dietitian, Erik. It's been a few weeks, couple months maybe. I don't know, losing track of time these days since we've had you on the channel. So appreciate you being here tonight with us. I know you have a lot going on in your life. So I'm going to kick it over to you. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what's been going on in your life and the reason why we're here for this conversation with you tonight?
Yeah, so good to be back as always. I've got an ultra marathon in 1 week. So next Friday, I'm going to do the Bighorn 100-mile trail race. And I've been training for this race since December. So it's about a 6-month training block that I dedicated solely to this race. And I thought now that I'm fully geared up, ready to go into this race, it would be a really good time to talk about my nutrition strategy during training, obviously, because that's a huge component. And then my nutrition strategy going into race day and like what I plan to be consuming throughout the duration of the event.
Yeah, absolutely. And so you were saying earlier, or offline, about the title that we chose for tonight's episode, which I think is kind of funny how we came across it just talking offline and then just an offhanded comment. We're like, oh, let's run with that.
Oh,
And
for sure.
so, yeah, do you want to go into a little bit about what you were saying on like how the title is so fitting for running that ultra marathon?
Yeah. So carbs and caffeine are pretty self-explanatory, right? Like those are things that are going to be consumed during an event like that. But chaos, coming across that kind of randomly and just how it sounded, we're like, oh yeah, that sounds cool. But the more I thought about it, chaos is probably the best way to define in ultramarathon and planning nutrition for an ultramarathon. So I don't want to mess it up, but I looked up because I was like pretty confident in the definition, but I looked it up anyways. So essentially, it's chaos is a state of disorder, and it is this lack of order and predictability and organization. It's basically synonymous with mayhem. It's just craziness. So when it comes to nutrition for endurance events, extended duration endurance events like ultra marathons or even like probably pushing into Ironmans, you're on course for so long and your body's working so hard that a lot of the general rules of nutrition get bent or they don't apply. It's always fun to me because going over like the basics of nutrition for like standard endurance events or non-endurance events, there's always, all right, here's the rule of thumb. But then there's always, except for ultra marathons or except for, these extended duration endurance events. So the reason there are exceptions is because it's so hard, to get a ton of quality studies with ultramarathon runners, because a lot of high quality studies are going to do things like take blood samples, and like not a ton of people are going to sign up for that right out of the gate as they're about to run an ultramarathon. In addition to that, there's just not a huge population of ultra endurance runners. It's obviously a growing sport and there are studies in the field, but compared to like, marathon and less, where there's just a ton of data, it gets into this kind of newer area of studies. So planning for it can be quite challenging. And a lot of it comes down to just mental preparedness, being really good to think on your feet and have contingency plans, because plan A during an extended duration event like this typically isn't going to work out. And we can dive into that more, but like I have a plan of what I'm going to eat during the event for, my goal is like 28 hours or less. And odds are several of those options aren't going to work out where I want them to, because my palate just might not be accepting that. I might be nauseous. Who knows? So I've got contingency plan. Like if I don't want to eat that, like here's my backup. If that doesn't sound appealing, here's my backup to that. So it's just planning like that. And then obviously having done a couple, to kind of know what to expect. Like having done this exact course. So last year I did half of this course, which is 52 miles. I know the route, I know what to expect. And I kind of know like, all right, if this happens, I may not want that food. So here was a good backup that I had on hand. And, that's kind of, that's my plan, is having several plans, if that makes sense.
No, yeah, it's perfect because I mean, how often in life do things work out exactly how we hope they will. So it's always great to have that plan for when it doesn't actually work out. So let's rewind a little bit. You told me you started training specifically for this race back in December. So what did what did fueling for those training sessions back then and leading up to the race look like for you?
Yeah, so I'll just briefly kind of talk about the training. It was so 6 months, 3 blocks. The first block was a lot of speed work, so high intensity compared to my normal endurance pace. So during that training block where I was doing a ton of high intensity speed work, my carbohydrate intake was higher and calorie intake was higher too, depending on the volume overall that week. During my middle block, which was purely an endurance block, volume was still high, but intensity was a little lower. So it was kind of more of like a neutral diet. I didn't do anything too sexy. Obviously, my carbohydrate intake throughout the entirety of the 6 months has been high, but it was like relative to that overall it being high, it was extra high during the high intensity blocks, and then it was like stabilized during my endurance block. And then in my strength block, it would really depend on the day. Carb intake still stayed high, but if I really broke down my legs hard, like if I did a long run on hills and did a strength training session, obviously then rebuilding any broken down tissue became a priority. So carbs are still high, but I definitely put more of an emphasis on protein during training days like that. So I think a lot of people, and this is something I've been working on doing live engagements. I always say, yeah, high carbs and protein, but I think a lot of people want to know about like what foods I eat. So totally depends on the day.
Well, so before we dive into the foods you ate, so you talked about the carbs for the intent of your training sessions or the stimulus you were trying to reach there. And so with that, with us having a little bit more higher intensity, obviously, me and you know that we are using carbs more for fuel there. So were you more so looking to replenish what you were losing there? Or is it a mixture of replenishing and also making sure, the tank was completely full so that way we can go with those high intensities? And then when you got into that more so endurance aspect where maybe we're starting to use fat for a little bit more fuel, you didn't have to necessarily have as many carbs in the diet. Is that what we're looking for with that?
Yeah. So first things first, let's talk about you. You raised a really good point. So as intensity increases, right, we start breathing heavy. We have less oxygen available to us. The metabolic pathways to metabolize carbohydrates and fat rely on oxygen. And the determining factor on which one's going to be prioritized more is the availability of oxygen. So carbohydrate metabolism is more efficient and requires less oxygen. So at higher intensities, carbohydrate is going to be the predominant fuel source burn. And I mean, like, we're talking in the 90% threshold, depending on the intensity. In addition to that, and this is something that you got to plan for, like me for this race, is when you're at elevation or altitude, okay, there's less oxygen available everywhere. It doesn't matter what intensity you're exercising, there's just simply less oxygen. Because of that, your body will also shift more towards carbohydrate utilization, even in the lower intensity activities. So yes, carbohydrate intake first, pre-workout, serves as not only an immediately available fuel source that I can use during the exercise, but what it's really accomplishing is it's helping my body not tap in and use all my glycogen. So then at the end of the workout, my body has less work to do to rebuild all of that glycogen. And then for extended training sessions that last, 2, 3, maybe 4 hours, that intra workout, right, taking carbs in every hour, right, in a certain amount, that's accomplishing that same exact mission. It's providing immediate fuel and also helping my body hold on to as much glycogen as possible for as long as possible. And then post-workout, absolutely. Your carbs post-workout are going to serve two main functions. A, it's going to be what is going to replenish your glycogen, right? Because it's a substrate. In addition to that, when you're doing any work that breaks down muscle tissue and you're consuming protein, when you consume carbohydrates, the response in the body is to secrete insulin, which is an anabolic hormone. That insulin will help shuttle those amino acids from the protein into your muscle tissue. So it helps and basically optimizes muscle protein synthesis, if that makes sense. But yeah, so pre-workout, intra-workout, post-workout, carbs, all for the reasons of being an immediate fuel source as well as replenishment.
I feel like that's your 2-minute advanced biochem class for everybody. Because you've done that with me a couple of times now. And every time you do it, I'm like, I remember sitting in Dr. Smith's class every Thursday night at 6 p.m. and just going through the pathways.
Oh, yeah. And like, I mean, we won't get into it in this live, but what I try to always tell my clients is those metabolic pathways are these complex systems, right? And I always compare the human body to like a car. So your macronutrients are going to be your gasoline. Okay. So the engine's going to burn the gasoline. All those parts and pieces along the way, the fuel lines, the spark plugs, things like that, those are all your micronutrients. So in those big complex biochemical systems, there's all these coenzymes and cofactors, and that's going to be things like calcium, magnesium, B vitamins. And that is why it is so important to eat a just wide, varied, and diverse diet, because you need all those micronutrients for those systems to operate efficiently.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, that's a good breakdown. So before we kind of rewinded, you were about to dive into, you said, yeah, I was intaking more carbs. I did less carbs here, but what those foods actually look like. Because I think that can be confusing at times of, hey, what's the right carb for me to get? And there's definitely a difference when we start to look at simple and complex carbohydrates and timing of it all. So what did the foods actually look like that you were eating leading up to your race?
In like a neutral state where I have like, let's call it normal training for me for training for this event, where it's nothing too intense. It's like a pretty baseline day. I try to eat as whole food based as possible. So I've got a high carb target. During this event, I'm typically I intuitively eat, so it's hard to say for sure, but I'd say roughly like 7 grams per kilogram body weight for carbohydrates. So it's relatively high. It breaks down to, for my caloric load, like 65%, 60 to 65% total calories. So if it's like a pretty standard day and it's nothing too intense, I try to get as much as I can from whole food. So for carbohydrates, definitely a lot of grains. So like oats, breads, pastas, things of that nature, lots of fresh fruit. Vegetables, if I have room to eat a ton of vegetables, like if the training volume was low and I can have those low calorie, high fiber foods to get all of those colors, I'm eating those for carbs. On the days where the intensity is high or my carb intake is just like ridiculous, and like there's this dilemma for an athlete that wants to eat clean and healthy, because those really healthy foods like fruits and vegetables offer you a ton. They're very nutrient dense, right? They're not empty calories. They're the opposite of that. They're full calories, full of vitamins and minerals. The problem is the carb load they offer you is relatively small. The calorie load they offer you is relatively small, and there's a ton of fiber in it. So it makes you feel full. So when you have to eat a ton to fuel your body, those foods unfortunately aren't helping you out. So that is where you have to dive into the fun foods, which obviously, like, who doesn't want to eat a ton of fun foods? So during high intensity work, I'm pretty nasty. I like Pop-Tarts, Rice Krispie treats, Belvita snack crackers.
I do love Belvita. They're so good. They're especially the blueberry ones.
Yeah, I do the blueberry and I'm a cinnamon guy for sure.
Nice.
But I like both. Like, I'm not too picky. I do those Nature Way or something, the fig bars.
Oh, yeah. Those are good.
Really like those a lot. For solid foods when I'm running, which is also something you need to start practicing if you're going to be in the endurance scene where you're going to need to eat solids on course. I really like Rice Krispie treats. They digest extremely quick. They don't take up a ton of space in my stomach. There's almost no fat in them, whereas like Pop-Tarts will give you about 7 grams. That will sit in my stomach longer. So it works when I'm on a slow, maybe a climb, where I'm not like running super fast. But other than that, breakfast cereals are huge for me. So I'm a kid from the 90s. So like eating, like Cinnamon Toast Crunch or Honey Smacks or Golden Crisp, shit like that is just like a ton of sugar. It really helps me bump up my carbs to hit my goal. And this is something I tell clients too, is I know going into it that those are empty calories. Like I'm eating that added sugar and I know it's not providing me anything but the carbohydrates as energy. But I know that my caloric intake for that day is so high based on my volume of training. I still have ample room of foods to eat that are going to be clean. Like I'll still get my servings of vegetables and fruits in just outside of my training block. But pre-workout, intra-workout, and post-workout, I'm eating a ton of simple carbohydrates just to hit that number. And because the simple carbohydrates are going to get delivered into my bloodstream quicker. So
Yeah. And it's interesting because, start looking at glycemic index. We know we want those foods that are high on glycemic index for performance like immediately. And it's funny when you see like some of these athletes, like football, you see somebody eating Skittles and somebody who doesn't know, they're, oh my God, they're eating Skittles in game. That's awful. And then when you do know, you're like, no, there's actually a purpose for that. That's the right thing to do. Not saying that should be your diet all the time, but we look for, like you said, absorbing it quickly. Those foods high in sugars, unfortunately, it is. And that's why, like, I'll never forget. I worked with an individual once. He was a little older, but he was very upset that the team was having Powerade during the game, and he believed that that's why individuals were cramping during the game earlier in the season. I'm like, it had nothing to do with it being 95 degrees and humidity was awful. And he went on a rant about they're cramping because we're giving them Powerade. We need to stop giving them Powerade. And I remember I was probably 23, 24 at the time. And I argued, well, if we stop giving them Powerade, they're going to cramp more. And the look I got, I was like, ooh, I may be looking for a new job soon.
Yeah, like people that aren't accustomed to fueling properly, especially with carbohydrates, because I think over the past, however many years, carbs being demonized has just proliferated through the interweb, right? Across all social media platforms. And I talk about this a lot. We get these studies that are read by the wrong populations, right? So for an average person that's overweight, maybe borderline diabetic or diabetic, yeah, like we want to avoid foods with added sugar as much as possible, right? But if you're an individual that's an athlete, like you're not an overweight borderline diabetic. So like a study from a population full of borderline diabetics that are overweight does not translate to an athletic population. And somehow this data from those studies gets bled into the athletic community. And now everyone's like scared of carbohydrates, which is mind blowing. I mean, you look at Gatorade, right? Why do you think Gatorade was invented in the first place? Like that didn't come about for free. Like money was spent to research and provide athletes with a fuel source to make them perform better. They don't put Gatorade or they don't put sugar in Gatorade for no reason at all. Again, if you're an overweight pre-diabetic that doesn't exercise, yeah, you probably shouldn't be consuming Gatorade. But if you're a sports player or an active individual consuming it strategically right before an event, during an event, right after an event, that is what it is designed for. That's why I think Gatorade Zero is hilarious. I mean, I guess it's for people that like aren't athletic that still want to drink Gatorade. Like, awesome. You get the sugar-free stuff, but now athletes go into like a gas station. They're like, oh, I got to get some Gatorade to like replenish. And they buy the Zero and it's like, you're doing nothing for yourself. Like the amount of sodium is negligible in Gatorade Zero.
I will say that I gave a lot of Powerade Zero to our overweight players, especially after walkthroughs when I'm like, you didn't do anything. You do not need to pound two Powerades when you're already 15 pounds overweight. Two Powerades full sugar.
Absolutely. And it all comes down to like knowing yourself and knowing what you need. Like even for me, like there's certain exercises that I'm going to do that were relatively low intensity that I didn't do much. Like, yeah, I'm not going to just like eat a ton of carbs after that. Like that didn't require it. But when I grind for 3 hours on the trail, like I'm freaking loading up before, I'm eating plenty during, and I'm definitely loading up after for my recovery.
Yeah, it's definitely the timing of it because I go back to our overweight guys. Like they didn't need Powerade, full sugar Powerade during a walkthrough, but then in fall camp, yes, drink all the Powerades you need to get through fall camp to replenish to be able to do that practice later in the day. And I remember times like them getting a regular Powerade and looking at me, I'm like, no, that's the right move. Do that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you remember those? You're talking about Gatorade. Do you remember those commercials of us growing up when it was? I'm sure they were on ESPN, where it was like the University of Florida and it was for Gatorade, and they're talking about when it was invented, and it's like that redneck voice, and they're like, naturally, we call our stuff Gatorade.
For sure. Man,
it was
it
the
was a good
glass
time to be
bottle, I
alive.
think.
Yeah.
So, no. Awesome. So that's what it looked like a little bit out a ways from the race. Now, this is one I always think about Michael Scott, and I think we talked about it on the phone the other day. Carb loading leading up to it. What does that actually look like? Because I know it's not Michael Scott just pounding some fettuccine Alfredo right before going to run his 5K that he couldn't finish.
Yeah, so, I think a lot of people growing up playing sports also did something similar. I know a lot of teams, like I know teams I was on, like big pasta dinner before game night, right? So it had good intention, but what we know now is that if you really want to do a proper carb load, it needs to be like days in advance. It needs to be like a slow buildup. And it's two things. It's not just nutrition where you're eating obviously a higher volume of carbohydrates and then getting closer, manipulating protein, fat, and fiber. It's also making sure that you're not exercising a bunch, because at all times throughout the day, you're burning a certain amount of fat and carbohydrates, right? So you're going to burn some glycogen no matter what you do. But leading up to a big event, like the more you can restrict your activity, the less glycogen you're going to use. So activity comes basically near zero, especially like leading up to race day. It's a little bit different with professional athletes and people that are like top of their game. Like they're just built a little different, and they're so, I guess, efficient in the way they exercise and use nutrition that they'll exercise a little bit closer to game time essentially than like the average person. For me, for example, like I'll be ceasing all activity Sunday. I will be doing basically nothing except maybe doing like a mile run, shake out my legs, or some walk runs, just keeping my legs fresh, but really trying to conserve glycogen. So really low activity and then upping carbs. So ideally you have 7 days, right? So something that like a tactical athlete won't have going into an event, right? Like let's say you're a firefighter, it's been a really slow week, but then you have a massive fire and it's just this huge endurance event putting this thing out. Like you can't plan for that. Or maybe you're, a Green Beret and you've got an op that just kind of popped up. Like you can't plan for that. So for them, it's a little bit more challenging. But when we have predetermined events or games that we know in advance, like I know my event's next Friday, or if you're in football, I know game day's Saturday or Sunday or whatever it is, and you can plan for it, then we can really be strategic about our carbohydrate loading. So if you have 7 days, you start out at about 3 grams per pound, okay? That's your total carbohydrate load for the day. And then days like 3 to 0, so 3 to race day, you're going to up it to like 4 to 5 grams per pound body weight. That translates roughly to 10 to 12 grams per kilogram of body weight in those last final days leading up to race day. In addition to your carbohydrates being elevated right before race, so like let's call it T-1, right? So the day before race day, you can also lower your protein and fat intake and fiber intake to make room for more carbohydrates, essentially, and more simple carbohydrates. And the whole purpose of the carbohydrate load is to make sure that your glycogen is 100% topped off, as fueled as possible going into race day. And that's a huge part of it. But then the other big part of it we can talk about next would be like your pre-race meal, that breakfast before the event, or if the event's in the afternoon, your lunch or whatever it is, but your nutrition day of. But yeah, that's what the carb load looks like if you have 7 days. Now, if you don't have 7 days, maybe you have 3 days, you can go ahead and just jump up to that 4 to 5 grams per pound in those 3 days leading up to the event. And that should hopefully saturate your glycogen stores, as much as possible. In addition to that, hold on, I lost my train of thought. We're talking carb load, 7
Wait,
days
so
out.
while you try to remember that train of thought, you said, making sure your glycogen levels are topped off and, taking out some foods to like create that room. Is there a way for somebody to know that their glycogen levels are topped off, or is that just trial and error through time?
Yeah,
Is anything like any side effects they might see if it's obviously we can look at GI distress when you have too much in one sitting.
Yeah, so there are some physical manifestations. So glycogen holds water, right? So when your glycogen's fully topped off, you might physically note that you look a little more bloated or full, because if your glycogen is 100%, you're going to have water weight. That's why professional fighters will typically deplete glycogen a significant amount leading to a weigh-in, because they know that glycogen is going to hold on to water. So for obviously weight dependent sports, that's an issue if you have a weigh-in that matters and you're close. But yeah, other than that, though, other than that physical manifestation, you really won't know. I mean, it's unfortunate. It'd be really nice if, maybe one day we've got like a meter in our arm and it's like,
Yeah, like your gas tank.
Glycogen, 83%.
Yeah.
Like, eat this. Like, oh, okay, let me like down a gel or something really quick. But unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. So we just have to trust the studies and try to eat as much as we can. And man, it's really individual too. Like, obviously, some people are more efficient at metabolizing carbohydrates than others, especially people that have trained their gut already to do so. And that's another big factor in these endurance races, is like your carb intake per hour so high, you need to physically train your gut. It actually has adaptations that occur in the lumen of your small intestine to accept that many carbohydrates. Most people, if they haven't consumed carbohydrates in that high amount, can't go into an event and just all of a sudden consume 90 grams of carbohydrates an hour. Like, those carbohydrates will not get absorbed. They'll sit in their small intestine. They might sit in the stomach and just cause issues, cause possibly diarrhea, bloating, just like very uncomfortable GI symptoms. So all that needs to be teased out in training.
Yeah, similar to, you don't eat red meat for 6 months, you go and have a gigantic steak, you're probably going to be pretty sick.
Yeah.
I think they used to say Stallone, whenever he was doing the Rambo movies, that he cut so many carbs, and then one of the movies, the premiere afterwards, they had steak or whatever else, and he got extremely sick. So then the rest of the movies, he'd cut carbs for it. But then before the premiere, he would start building up his tolerance with like cheeseburgers from McDonald's so he wouldn't get sick at the premiere dinner. I remember hearing that years ago. I can't remember who told me that. It had to be a dietitian. Who else would know that?
I think we just got to get him on this podcast, bring him on and ask.
Exactly. Yeah. He'll be our next guest.
That would be awesome.
That'd be a tough one to follow, though.
True. Maybe Arnie.
Just get all of them from that time. So, all right. So getting back to tonight's conversation, we talked about carb loading that week of, and we were just about to dive into your pre-race meal. What does that look like? And are people differing? Because I know you start looking at it in other sports, like how many grams of carbohydrates based off how many hours out we are. Do you think that's something that changes based off the individual and what they can tolerate?
Yeah, absolutely. But that 3-2-1 rule works really good if you can tolerate. So if you've been doing this long enough and you're fueling appropriately, the 3-2-1 rule works great. It really comes down to when's your event. So for example, last year my race started at 5 a.m. So like I had to get up at 4 just to eat something. Like I didn't want to wake up at 3 because now I'm sacrificing sleep. I knew I wouldn't be able to fall asleep early just because I want to. So I had to like balance it. So yeah, I did about 1 gram per kilogram body weight an hour before, and I kept it as simple as possible. I had no protein, no fat. It was pure carbs. It was bagels with honey, I think is what I did last year. And obviously like measured out and calculated to get right around that 1 gram per kilogram mark. This year, the 100 mile starts the day before, and it starts at 9 a.m. So the plan is to wake up at 6 and get something down. So I got ample time to like squeeze in a big meal. And I've been planning this out for 6 months. So it's gone back and forth between a couple things, but right now I've got my heart set on a huge bowl of honey or Golden Crisp cereal with skim milk. So I'll get a little protein in, but no fat, a little bit of fat from the cereal. And I'm talking like a big bowl of cereal. And then I'm going to pair it either with a bagel and honey or Pop-Tarts.
Nice. The next question I have, I know we said it early on at the beginning, but the hydration. So we look at, we talked about those races starting pretty early, 5 a.m. So another thing that happens fairly often in the mornings is people need to pee pretty frequently in the mornings. So you hear it all the time in the tactical profession with people talking about tactically dehydrating themselves. So you obviously do not want to dehydrate yourself for a race. But what things are we looking to intake to make sure that we're hydrated, but I'm also not having to piss every 30, 45 minutes during the race?
So with this event in particular, like it doesn't matter how many times I need to piss. Like to me, losing a couple seconds taking a piss does not nearly compare to the risk of even entering a slight state of dehydration, because in an event like this that's so long, that can cascade so quickly. 5Ks, 10Ks, halves, full marathons, man, you can sneak by in a dehydrated state. Like you can just push through, get to the finish line. So yeah, like you could maybe argue like not overhydrating so you don't have to pee in the middle of a marathon, where like that time frame is a lot more condensed than something like a 100-mile race. But for my event in particular, I want to be pissing nearly clear going into that event, and I'm going to stay on top of it heavily throughout the event. I'm starting in probably 70-degree temps, approaching 85 mid-race, midday the first day, and then it's going to be pushing like low temps, like possibly high 30s when I get to the high elevated point around 8,000 feet. And then on the return day, it's going to be the same thing. It's going to be super hot in the canyon. So staying on top of my hydration is priority number one. I will not risk. I can piss as many times as it takes, but I will not sacrifice getting into a dehydrated state. I think if you were to talk to maybe a professional ultramarathon runner, I'm a complete novice. But if you were to talk to a professional, they may be a little bit more particular about how much they're taking in. To them, maybe taking a piss more frequently is an issue. I've never heard of that being an issue, but maybe they're thinking like that. But again, this is a long game, right? I mean, split times between athletes is not like a 100-meter dash. Like they're big gaps typically. So people don't typically sweat stopping to stop when they need to. I mean, you'll see professionals even stop at aid stations, sit down. They're typically on a clock, but I mean, it's pretty generous, 10, 15 minutes. They're stopping, sitting in a chair, doing what they need to do. Obviously, you're not going to see that during a marathon, right? Where people are like, they are cruising. They don't even want to stop to grab a cup of water from one of the tables. Like they've got it dialed in. They're going to go straight through. So it totally depends on the event. But yeah, it's a great point. Other hydration strategies is you could do what's called hyperhydration. So like 2 hours prior to the event, you can consume like 1 to 2,000 milligrams of sodium with like 10 to 12 ounces of water and kind of saturate your sodium stores. We don't really store sodium like glycogen, but saturate your body with some sodium. That will help you retain more water and stay hydrated for a longer period of time to help kind of stave off dehydration going into the event. Sorry, Ben, I lost volume if you can hear me.
Sorry.
There we go.
Yes, that makes sense. We start looking at obviously getting a lot of electrolytes in there. If we're looking at a shorter race, do we want to maybe have more fruit in there as well? Since obviously we get a lot of hydration from fruit.
For a shorter race?
Yeah.
No, typically not. So with any shorter races, for me personally, I tend to recommend and personally use like all oral nutrition. So if you're doing like a 5K, 10K half full for time, you can probably get away with just gels with water from the aid stations, or if you can carry some sort of, because when you consume gels or like chew carbohydrates, you need to have water with that. You can't just consume the gel. It needs to have hydration. Otherwise, if you're able to wear like a vest, you could try products like Scratch or Tailwind. Those are going to be really helpful in longer endurance events because you can carry obviously a Camelback plus 2 flasks, maybe more. But for short races, you don't typically want solid foods in your stomach because you may risk that making you upset. You're typically also running at a faster pace. So when you're running high intensity, faster pace, that jostling motion is going to make it a little bit more uncomfortable in your stomach. So if you're going to eat a solid, it should be something super simple, like again, like a Rice Krispie treat or candy, something that's basically just pure sugar. Fruit is great for long distance events when you're moving a little bit slower and you can eat it slowly in small amounts and let your body kind of, absorb it out of your stomach and do its thing. Now, again, this is something that's very individualized. Like I know people that could be running a fast-paced marathon and crush a piece of fruit and just be totally fine. But I know other people that might eat a piece of fruit even at a slow jog and then be like, oh man, this is like jacking my stomach up. It's super individual. The way we digest food is very individual to us. And that's something, again, that needs to be teased out in training. Like anything you do race day, you should have tried a couple times at the very least during training, because you might try it once and it went really well. And then you try it race day and it just totally jacks you up. So to try things 2, 3, maybe 4 times during training and just make sure like, yep, all right, that's going on my list. Like I can eat that solid food. It's not causing me issues. Really, really important. So your head's in the right place. Fruit, obviously, source of hydration, healthy carbohydrates. The problem is because it's also containing fiber, it's going to empty out of our stomach slower. So it would be my first choice for a short distance race.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. So intra-race, what is your nutrition looking like there? Obviously, carbohydrates are going to be very important. I know we talked a little bit offline. So yeah, what does that look like?
Yeah, so I'm going to be aiming roughly between 75 and 90 grams of carbohydrates every hour. Calorically, this isn't matching up perfectly, but between like 200 and 400 calories per hour, like that's just my goal. And doing math when I'm running is going to be a little tough. So I've got it pretty much planned out. So,
yeah, mile 13, just trying to do 4 times whatever at that point.
Yeah. So I
At 4
basically
times
have
63, I'm looking at.
I've got one liquid option. So on my flasks, I'm going to have 50 grams of Tailwind, and I've got multiple flavors of Tailwind just because with an event so long, you tend to get sick of certain flavors, like things that you never thought you would be adverse to consuming. You're just like, I can't, like it makes me nauseous even thinking about consuming that. So I've got several flavors. I'm doing DeWalter melon, I'm doing grape, and I've got my caffeinated raspberry to introduce some strategic caffeine during the night portion of the race. And then I've got a recovery mix that has a little bit of protein in it and a little bit higher sodium. So I'm going to be doing all of those. I'll always have every hour, hopefully I can get it down, one of those with 500 mils of water. In addition to that, I've got solid options. My solid options vary big time. So I've got gels. I'm going to be using the BPN gels. I'm going to be using mango and the apple cinnamon. I've got BPN Go bars for like a more solid chew kind of texture. I've got Rice Krispie treats. I've got Pop-Tarts. And that's pretty much my solid options on the sweet side. And then for salty, because one thing that's really important too is you might think like, oh man, I could eat sweet stuff all day. But eventually you do really start to get sick of the taste sweet. You want sour, umami, salty. So my salty snacks are going to be Chex Mix, Flavor Blasted Goldfish. And the reason I choose those is good carbohydrate load, good sodium load, low in fat. That's really big because, again, during intra-workout, during work, I don't want food that's going to sit and take time to digest in my stomach. So lots of fat, bad idea. Lots of fiber, bad idea. Lots of protein, bad idea. So it's got to be carbs. A little bit of fat's acceptable, a little bit of protein's acceptable, even a little bit of fiber's acceptable, but not going overboard in any one of those categories. So those are my salties. Go ahead.
So we look at, I think a lot of people will do like the mini bags of trail mix, and we start looking at a nut, which is obviously a fat. You look at the M&Ms, a lot of sugar, a lot of fat in there as well. So would you say that's not necessarily the best move for somebody to take in a endurance event? But I think it's very popular if people do it.
If you're like hiking a mountain where you're just rucking essentially, and the intensity is a lot lower than if you're running, yeah, you can get by probably eating trail mix. It's like a food that's really or calorie dense, so it'll help you stay fueled when you're out backpacking in the mountains or elk hunting and things like that. You don't have a ton of space. Food takes up weight, right? So like the more calories you can pack into a small space, the better. Well, fat's your best choice because it's the most calorically dense nutrient. But for performance, no, high fat is not a great choice. Now, I will say that there are certain ultra endurance runners that have tried a high fat strategy. So they have trained high fat and their bodies have become adapted to burn higher fats. There's only one runner that I can think of that has done really well with that strategy in like the pro circuit. I'm pretty sure he won Western States. One runner out of however many other runners, like it's just not convincing enough to me to like go for that strategy. And I also
you also said he's a pro, so like
yeah.
genetically.
And I also want to know like if he did a high carb strategy during that same event he won, would he have beat his leading time? Like he already won, but if he did a carb strategy, would he have went even further? hard to
Yeah,
know, right? Impossible to replicate. There's so many variables at play.
And that's the fun thing with science. And you start looking at it as like, well, they did that and they performed here, but what if they had done this instead? And you get into so many what ifs.
Right.
Like
And that's why you got to go off the data that suggests like the bigger populations, right? Like all of our data suggests that like carbohydrates is the strategy to go with. That may change in the future. Somebody may figure something out. And when that day comes, I'll willingly embrace it. But right now, that's where we're at.
Yeah, absolutely. And like going back to that, it's you look at some of these athletes, like professional football players and whatever other sport, with such bad diets, and there's always the question of like, well, what if? Like, what if they did this with their diet? But then you could also argue, and we start to look at the mental side of it, is whatever they're eating, like that's what they want to eat. So if you were trying to pressure them and, hey, you have to eat this, you have to eat that, like how do they respond mentally to that? Do they then shut down? Again, there's so many what ifs.
Yeah, and I mean, even with that same mindset, like you'll see professional ultra endurance runners like crush a cheese quesadilla, like super high in fat. But like in that moment, right? Like calories is the name of the game. These guys are like 100, 200 miles in. They just need fuel at that point. And typically, like at that point in the race, they're not going to be running super fast. Like, man, a 12-minute miles fast, you're 200 miles into a race. So eating a cheese quesadilla, like the mental satisfaction of switching it up from something sweet, I mean, that could be a total game changer. And that's why, again,
it just sits so poorly in my stomach.
Oh, like, I mean, I personally can't think of eating that.
Just thinking about eating a quesadilla, then going out and running at 85 degrees sounds awful to me.
Dude, last year at one of the aid stations at this race, they had McDonald's cheeseburgers and hamburgers like ready to go. And it was like 90 degrees outside this tent. And they had like any food you can imagine, but like straight up cheeseburgers. And I'm sure after 100 miles, like at that point, a 100-mile racer would have been at like mile 77. Man, if you're just going to walk after that aid station and you want it, like
and just unwrapping your cheeseburger and enjoying it.
Yeah. Hide the tears a little bit.
Your feet just hurt horribly at that
point.
Oh,
yeah. Just so much pain.
Well, anything else you want to add towards the nutrition in race?
Yeah. So the only thing I forgot to mention is obviously hydration is key, right? Like aiming for, like, I'm going to try to aim for like about almost a liter an hour if I can do it. Like maybe 0.75, like somewhere in that range. Because I know I'm running through a lot of heat. I know I'm going to be sweating a lot. In addition to that, my sodium load, I'm a salty sweater, so I'm going to be aiming for like anywhere between 700 and 1,000 milligrams every hour just to stay on top of it.
All right. Yeah, makes sense. So we've covered leading up to the race. We've covered week of the race. We talked about during the race. What's the first meal you're going to once that race ends?
Man, I thought about this a lot because obviously it's like a big moment. You just finished, and like you expect that you're just like ready to crush whatever you want, like kind of like your last meal, before going into anything. But last year I finished the race and like I was so nauseous I couldn't eat anything.
Yeah,
I made a big plate of food, like burger, hot dog, watermelon, pasta salad, and like I couldn't eat anything. But I will say the day after that, I went to McDonald's and I got a Big Mac, a McChicken, and a filet of fish. And it was exceptional. So I'm sure McDonald's on the drive home will be a pit stop. But other than that, I don't really have like a food that I'm planning to eat because I'm just planning to not be hungry for anything specific. I've got somebody I know that joined the Marine Corps with me is friends with a guy that owns this company called Ruck. They are awesome products. It's like this big shake essentially, and it's just super nutrient dense, tons of carbs. It's got your fat, it's got your protein, it's got vitamins and minerals, and it's really meant for like outdoor activities where like it's hard again to pack food, right? You can just mix water with this thing and drink it. So my backup plan, if I'm not hungry immediately after the race, I know how important recovery is in that moment. I'm going to shake that thing up with some water and just force myself to get it down. Because it's just a ton of nutrition all at once. And then I can like kick my feet back and then hopefully my appetite comes back for that night. And I'm sure we're going to go out into town. I mean, pizza's like an obvious choice. Like I'm a huge pizza dude. So if my appetite's back and I'm not totally dead or asleep, I will crush probably an entire pizza.
Yeah, absolutely.
Lots of sodium, lots of carbs, fat.
Yeah, definitely. So not necessarily nutrition related, but you talked about the temperatures of this race. So you talked about upper 30s to mid 80s. What is like packing clothing? What does that look like? Because that's obviously, we look at 55 degrees difference. You're
Yeah.
not wearing the same thing throughout, right?
No, correct. So in this race in particular, it's a there and back. So I'm going A to B and then B back to A. So along that route, there are 3 major aid stations. At major aid stations, I'm going to have drop bags. And in drop bags, I'm going to have strategically placed items, right? So like at the second major aid station on the way up, that's where I'm going to pick up my running leggings, my rain jacket, my beanie, gloves, headlamp, like things to prepare for a cold evening going into the third major aid station. That way I have it. Then at that aid station, depending what time is it, I can either drop some gear if the sun's coming up. If it's not, I'll probably run back down to the aid station I came from and drop gear. But all of those drop bags are strategically packed with items I need. I'll have spare shoes, I'll have spare socks. And then also we've got a pit crew that's going to be with us, following us to each of those major aid stations. They'll like pop up a camping chair for us to sit in really quick if we need to change shoes. I'm going to have them heat me up some ramen noodles just for like some hot real food that's not in a package, even though ramen's in a package. But you know what I mean? It's different if it's in a bowl. And then I'm also doing some of those Eggo cinnamon toast waffles with syrup. And I'm planning and I'm really hoping I'm in the mood for it because it sounds so good to me. Like just getting like a fresh toasted waffle with syrup right at the major aid station halfway point. So that's the plan.
Nice.
But yeah, it's all about those drop bags and just like properly packing. I've even got like sun shirts so I don't have to like lather up a ton of sunscreen. I've got Body Glide in every bag, like just a ton of gear that you might need. I've got a blister kit in my pack that I'm going to have with me the whole time. I've got KT tape that I'm going to have in those major drop bags in case like my knees go out and I need to like just kind of like stitch myself back together with bubble gum and duct tape.
No, yeah. No, man, that's gonna be awesome. You said this is next Friday, correct?
Yeah.
So we're getting close.
Yeah, I'm super fired up.
So, yeah, man. Well, I think this has been very beneficial. I think there's been a lot of nutrition information from 6 months out to afterwards that is very practical for a lot of individuals who are listening to this. Is there anything else you want to leave the people with tonight as far as nutrition wise for any endurance event?
Yeah, absolutely. So really quick, I want to run over to school quick because Brian put out a message if anybody had questions going into this YouTube live. So I just want to make sure there's no fresh questions.
Yeah, so I don't think I saw that.
Okay, so there's one from Dan F, and I addressed him briefly on school, but it sounds like I'm just going to go ahead and read the question. So he's balancing a ramp up in strength training and tapering now for a 10K this Saturday. And he said, what's the best fuel for the next 2 days to be ready? So going back to what we talked about, right? Like 2 days, and now it's even shorter than 2 days. He's pretty much got tonight and tomorrow. So obviously focusing on carbohydrates is going to be big, and possibly lowering protein and fat and fiber tomorrow just to make extra room for carbohydrates going into the event. Now, it's really tricky not knowing this individual and having worked with him already because I don't know what his tolerance to carbohydrates is. If he jumps into that 4 to 5 grams per kilogram body weight, it may cause some GI discomfort because he's not used to that high of carbohydrates. So, Dan, if you're listening or if you're going to watch the video, just like you got to know yourself. But my recommendation would be like 4 to 5 grams per pound body weight, or like I said in the messages, like 7 to 10 grams per kilogram would be a pretty safe bet too if you wanted to use that metric. Other than that, your pre-race meal, obviously high in simple carbohydrates. And then for a 10K, you shouldn't need any intra-workout. But if you're going to be on course for longer than an hour, feel free to do like a gel with some water, something along those lines. But hopefully everything else was covered more in depth throughout the duration of this live event. Other than that, what do I want to leave people with for an endurance event? Man, get out and do endurance events. They are super fun. They challenge you in such unique ways. And if you are a nerd with training and nutrition, it's super fun to learn because it's just like such a unique environment of athletic performance. There's so many variables at play. You get to mess around with new gear, new nutrition strategies, and it just changes it up. Not to mention you build up an awesome like aerobic base, so that can go well with any other sport. But yeah, so get out there and do it. And obviously, if you have any questions, you know where to find me.
Yeah. Well, Erik, best of luck. I think this has been an extremely awesome conversation tonight. I look forward to the AAR of your race in maybe a few weeks. We can break that all down, see what you felt, because I'm sure there'll be, like you said, you've done it before, but you ran that trail before, but you learn from every experience, right? So yeah, we definitely need to do a follow-up AAR on here, because I think it'd be extremely beneficial for people to hear as well. Because like you said, very early on in the show, you have a plan. The plan's not always going to fall in line like you expect. So having those adjustments ready to go as needed. So appreciate you guys being on here with us tonight. If you're interested in training with us or working with Erik, please follow the links in the description below. We'll see you guys next week.